Hello everyone, Duplex here with another Android Netrunner video. It's been a while since my last video, so I thought I'd put one together and put it up. This is one of the decks, this Building a Better World deck here that I'm playing, is one of the decks that I'm considering to bringing to the World Tournament in November. You can see my initial hand was a little lackluster, and so I mulliganed, and my second hand wasn't that much better, but at least I had two pieces of ice. At the end of turn one, I've got ice on HQ, a data pike, and an ice wall, I believe it is, on R&D, but I've got three agendas sitting in my hand. So, playing against Kate, and the first thing that my opponent does is play a Professional Contacts. It's a great opening move. Excuse me. The second thing they do is a Data Sucker, and I think click 2 was actually using Professional Contacts to grab a card, and then they spend a click running on Archives solely for the Data Sucker virus token. It's a little odd. Not sure why they didn't face check, but I get another hedge fund and toss it out and end up having to draw because now I've got fully 4 agendas in hand. Oh, sorry about that. 4 agendas in hand, and I fortunately did find a Hadrian's Wall. Diesel, it fills up their hand, my opponent's hand again, and I think we're going to see an Underworld Contacts, and so I pull another Data Pike. Now I notice my opponent is not face checking at this point, hasn't probed my 2 iced servers at all. So I decide that it's time to start scoring some of the ridiculous number of agendas that I'm holding. The geothermal fracking is just a great economy card. The bad publicity is not wonderful, but it's great to have it out early game. Keeps my bigger pieces of ice rezzed if I need it. So so you can see here, it throws out a borrowed satellite, brings his link up to 2, making his Underworld Contacts valuable, and then puts out a Keymaster, a Code Gate Breaker, which is bad news for me. I've got 2 Data Pikes, one on HQ and one on my remote right now, but he doesn't know that, so he hasn't face checked anything. And I'm half expecting, and you can also see that I pulled another agenda. So I'm expecting him to start probing at this point, but I do manage to score my geothermal fracking agenda. So he spends first 2 clicks throwing out Hostage, and I think we'll end up seeing, if not this turn, then next, we'll end up seeing he pulled another Underworld Contacts, but still doesn't probe any, doesn't face check any servers, and so yeah, he's still building an economy and not taking any of the risks. So either he's really shy on icebreakers, cash-wise he's not doing so hot. So I score out of hand, leaving me with 16 credits at the end of that turn. And I fortunately do find another piece of ice. So this is definitely in contention. This deck is definitely in contention for what I'm going to be bringing to Worlds. I had some limited degree of success with my Jinteki Replicating Perfection deck at the Plugged In Tour in Toronto a couple weeks ago. Unfortunately, towards the end, my last match, I ended up losing both, dropping me out of contention for a decent showing. I think that had a lot to do with the ridiculously late hour and my lack of sleep. Just, yeah, it caught up with me. I started making bad decisions, and when you're playing a Jinteki trap deck, you kind of have to make good decisions and not make mistakes. So here we see him tossing out an Atman, and he will place it at strength 1, which I thought was a little odd because it ends up focusing on the one piece of ice that he has face checked, which is an ice wall, but it's an advanceable piece of ice. So at this point of the game, I'm assuming that my opponent is fairly inexperienced, and towards the end, or at the end of the game, the little text conversation I have with him confirmed that he is fairly new to the game. So if he had face checked at any of the previous 3 turns or so, if he had face checked HQ, he could have walked away with, if not 1, then probably several agenda points stolen out of my hand. Now, at this point, he also needs to start worrying about Archer. I have agendas that I can exile, that I can sacrifice for Archer, and I am playing Weyland, so, but I don't know if he knows that much about the various archetypes in the game. So here I'm sort of humming and hawing about how I should approach Ice Wall and his Atman. I know he can get into R&D right now for the low price of 0, considering he's got, I think, 3 bad publicity at this, or maybe not, I'm not sure. He's got at least 1 bad publicity at this point sitting there, so Atman's going to cost him nothing to get into R&D. So I can advance Ice Wall twice fairly easily, and that would make it harder for him to get in, or impossible, depending on what else he's got back. Scavenge or even another Atman would fix that for a turn, but again, only 1 turn. So advanceable ice is really just a decent counter to Atman if you can afford to keep it up and keep it going. So instead, I decide to throw down an agenda and another piece of ice on remote, thinking if he scores 1 or maybe 2 agendas out of my R&D at this point, it's probably not game-changing. And he has no R&D interface at this point. He's sitting on 4 credits at the beginning of his turn, but he is playing Shaper, so a modded into an R&D interface is certainly possible, and you'll see in just a second that's exactly what he does. So not a bad play on his part. It's always good to keep those R&D interfaces a little bit hidden if you can, because it will lull some core players into a sense of, if not security, then at least will remove any kind of sense of urgency that they might have had in protecting R&D. So from my perspective, I haven't seen any of my 3 snares yet. I'm hoping that he's got 2 cards in hand right now. I'm really hoping he hits a snare for game over. And with an R&D interface out. So it takes him a second. I'm not sure if he was just thinking or away from the keyboard, but it takes him a second to actually to go ahead and break the ice wall, which he now does, and accesses a pair of cards. So the concept behind my Weyland deck here is lots of low-cost, fast scoring agendas, decent number of various strength ices to counter Catman decks, and the flexibility to flatline off of snares and scorched earths and mid-season if needs be. So, and he gets his virus tokens again, of course. I also have a single copy of Sea Source in this deck as well, which I never see in this game. But so you can see he got his second R&D interface out and managed to score a single point's worth of agenda. I don't really care about that. I have plenty of agendas worth in my hand, and now I see an archer, which he's also seen. And sometimes that's valuable because it's a threat. He is at this point not entirely sure of what kind of victory I'm going to be shooting for. So an archer is a threat to someone with, especially without a icebreaker for sentries. His Atman is theoretically a threat to it if he gets enough data sucker tokens. Of course, he would need 5, but it's not out of reach at this point. So I end up throwing the archer down on archives. I kind of thought here that it's a bit of an ace in the hole. If he starts to look for extra data sucker tokens, thinking the archer's on R&D, he might hit archives, and I could theoretically ditch some. Probably wasn't the smartest move on my part, but I find that every once in a while doing the unexpected will actually garner some interesting or positive results. But you'll see that it doesn't really ever become a huge issue. I get a second Hadrian's Wall, and I'm able to score another agenda, and that puts me at 5, so within reach of the victory. So he had a couple of different options available to him at this point. Of course, I can't see his hand or what kind of deck he's playing. He's got a decent economy. He's sitting on 11 credits, I believe, at this point. Yeah, and for some reason he was. If I didn't wonder if he was an inexperienced player at this point, I'm pretty sure I knew he was a fairly inexperienced player. But he starts to click on Atman, wondering, and then asks me in text whether or not it's possible to change the strength on Atman after it's installed, which of course it's not, because that would just be ridiculous. And so yeah, he asks me whether it's possible, and of course I say no. I'm not sure what he would have changed it to, given that the only piece of ice he knows about is already sitting at 1, which is where his Atman is. So it's a little, he must assume that that's an archer sitting there and maybe wants to change it, but I don't know what he would do about the ice wall. I'm a little lost. So yeah, anyway, he asks that, and I tell him no, and he proceeds to throw another daily cast down. And so at this point, I know that I can win if I need to, or if I'm smart, and it's entirely possible that I'm not, because I'm often not. So I get another geothermal fracking down with one advancement token on it, and I put another Hadrian's Wall out in front of that first Hadrian's Wall, And sitting at 23 credits after that advancement means that I can res both Hadrian walls, both copies of Hadrian's Wall, and have 3 left to finish scoring my agenda. So the math worked out, and that agenda will win me the game. So he throws out a second copy of Atman. I think he messes up. He ends up putting it back and then playing it again. I don't know if he said it incorrectly or what. And you'll see, I believe he puts it at 4. Yeah, so he puts it at 4, probably still thinking that there's an archer in play and that he's going to hit it at some point. 4 gives him the ability to use only 2 of his 3 data sucker tokens and have 1 left over if needs be. But he knows this is endgame. He's got to run that end server. If otherwise, he's just going to give me the game. So after a moment of thought, I will res the first Hadrian's Wall, which he can break because he has 3 virus tokens on data sucker, which would bring the strength from 7 to 4 and allow him to break it for just 2. But it won't allow him, unfortunately, to break the second one, which I can also afford to res. And he's on click 4, so this is really it for him. All or nothing, and so he's also fairly inexperienced at Octagon, asks how to use data sucker appropriately, which I instruct him on, and he will easily break the first Hadrian's Wall and then bounce off the second. And then at the end of the game, or as he passes it back to me, I'll simply advance and score geothermal fracking for my 6th and 7th agenda point. So my win rate with this deck is fairly high. I would say probably on Octagon, my win rate's probably in the range of, I'm going to say just below 80%. I have the stats somewhere, but I haven't compiled them recently. The last time I looked, it was probably around the between 75 and 80% win rate, which is a little bit better than what I'm scoring with my Jinteki. I find that because this deck has 2 very clear ways that it can win, I am able to shift gears fairly quickly and adjust to the various types of decks. When it comes to meta, the online meta can be a little daunting. I know a lot of people like to talk about the various deck archetypes and what does what and what feels good and what. And for example, I'm very much considering taking Catman deck to Worlds as my runner deck. And there's been a lot of sort of negative press about Catman in various forums. I think the main forums that I check on a regular basis are Board Game Geek and Card Game DB. And then sort of aggregate sites as well, like the Reddit, the subreddit for Netrunner, and the 1 or 2 other blogs for various podcasts and whatnot that I'll just check from time to time. So a lot of hate for Catman for one reason or another, and anybody who's been keeping track of the spoilers will know that it's probably not going to last for much longer, what with very specific counter cards being printed in future packs to kind of keep us away from playing pure AI icebreaker decks. I kind of like that. I don't necessarily think that, but that's just part of the evolving meta. What I don't necessarily like to see is the community, and especially the community leaders, people who a lot of other players, especially beginning players, look up to and look for advice from, playing the hate game on one type of deck or another, especially considering that 90% of the top winning decks that have been posted, especially for plugged in, have been Andromeda decks. And I love Andromeda decks. I love criminal decks. I think they're great decks, and I think they're the most competitive decks for a runner in the game right now, as evidenced by the fact that we're seeing them consistently floating to the top of the tournament standings. So when it comes to something like Catman, or like a Wizard Darwin or something along those lines, hearing community kind of come out against them as cheap or something is a little bit daunting and a little bit disgruntling, because I love the community for Netrunner. I love how the people interact. I love going to tournaments. We had a very successful tournament with the Bad Publicity guys here fairly recently, which went very wonderfully. We had a very good turnout. Bad Publicity, those guys know how to put on a tournament and know how to have fun, and that's the part of the game that I love. But I don't really like seeing the sort of the negative press when somebody shows up to the table and says, oh yeah, I'm playing Catman, or oh yeah, I'm playing HB Rush, or oh yeah, I'm playing NBN Rush, or Tag and Bag, or whatever it happens to be. The derision and sort of condescension that comes out because, well, the assumption is you must be net decking, which is a term that I guess comes from Magic the Gathering. I've never been involved in the Magic the Gathering online meta, so I don't really know for sure, but the concept of net decking, which is going online to the variety of Netrunner community place establishments and finding a posted deck, recreating it with your own cards, and going to a tournament and playing it, there's a lot of derision towards people who do that. And there's a lot of assumption that if you're playing Catman, or if you're playing HB Rush, or if you're playing one of those other very common, like Noise Mill, back when Noise Mill was a thing, that you must be net decking, so that somehow makes your contribution to the game or contribution to the tournament less or something. And the assumption is wrong. A lot of people, if a deck archetype is viable and potent, the assumption, by my estimation, is that you would assume that many people would arrive at that formula or some variation of that formula on their own. So when people look at Atman and they think about how is this going to work, and they try it out with Chaos Theory, and they try it out with the Professor, or whatever, and they eventually start running it with Kate, realizing Kate's good at it. She can do a bunch of other things really neat that work well with it, like clone ships for free, data suckers for free, parasites for cheap, etc., etc., etc. You start looking at the archetype and you realize this is just good. And you're going to arrive at many of the same card combinations with slight variations as people who have posted online. And so the community leaders online are doing great work because they're posting great deck ideas, they're posting their tactics and their thought processes when they're playing. It really helps beginner players get better quickly, because beginner players can look at that and say, oh, I see, never would have thought of that on my own, or their limited play pool, people don't play a certain way, so a certain type of play doesn't get exposed very much. But then they turn around and say, look what I learned online. I watched the Bad Publicity guys, or I listened to Agenda 7 or whatever, and I go to a tournament and I pull out the decks that I learned all about, and somebody looks at me like, oh, I see, you're just playing Catman, or oh, I see, you're just playing HB Rush or whatever. So I'm not really cool with that, right? Like, I think everybody should just play with whatever they feel like they're good with, and whatever they feel comfortable with, and whatever they feel competitive with. Because even though the game is, we're all here to have fun, and that's my primary goal, I'm still going to win, especially when it comes to tournaments. And I won't win at the expense of fun, because that turns the whole thing on its head, and then people stop wanting to come out. But part of having fun is trying to win and doing the best you can at it, and not feeling like you can't take a certain type of deck because you're afraid that, you know, somebody's going to look at you and say, oh, you must just be net decking, or oh, I've seen that, or I can't count how many times playing Personal Evolution at the Plugged In tour, I was asked, oh, you must be playing the Hollis deck. And to be honest, I'd heard of the deck, but I'd never watched a video or seen a deck list at all. And the fact that my Personal Evolution deck contained a single copy of Scorched Earth, didn't matter what the rest of the cards were, didn't matter how I played it. People looked at it and said, you're playing the Hollis deck. And I went, you know, this is not. This is the Duplex deck, and it's played differently, and it's built differently, and even if it's the exact same card list, I arrived at it on my own. And even if I didn't, even if I went online and found this deck list and looked at all of the explanations online as to why it was a good deck, then it's still going to be played very differently because it's a different player behind the cards. So that's just my 2 cents when it comes to meta, especially online meta, when it comes to this game. And I think Worlds is going to be a lot of fun. I'm really, really looking forward to it, especially after the Plugged In stuff, which were great events. If anybody watching this has gone to a Plugged In, I would love to hear your thoughts on how the tournaments went and what kind of decks you saw, what kind of decks you played, whatever. We're also going to be running more tournaments local here, Southern Ontario in Canada, to promote bad publicity, who are the guys that run them, and to just keep the fairly strong, healthy local meta here going, and keep people coming out. We see people from fairly far away. The Agenda 7 guys come. People from Toronto will sometimes show up. It's a great time, and I love the tournament. They're a bit long, but you know, it's good to have an entire day dedicated to playing a game that you love. So that said, I will sign off, as this has clearly gone well over time on my video. And thanks for watching. Rate, subscribe, comment, and keep watching, keep playing, and we'll see you at Worlds.